Much has already been said about the US's failure to qualify for the Olympics for a third time in a row. And there seems to be no shortage of excuses, from COVID to players just not wanting it enough and everything in between. But for me, as I stated before, the vast majority of blame lies at the feet of head coach Jason Kreis. Now here's why. As head coach of the U23 team, Kreis's only objective was to qualify for the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Now, some try to say that the fact that this pre Olympic tournament was pushed back a year because of COVID is the main reason why this squad is so different from the one that ended up in Mexico. Now, hold on. The fact that it was postponed a year is exactly why CONCACAF decided to allow all the players that have turned 24 since to still be considered age eligible. So, in theory, teams could still have fielded the exact same roster that was chosen back in 2020. So, why was that not possible for the US? Well, first of all, some players just weren't available due to injury. Paxton Pomykal, Richard Ledesma, and later Uli Yanis are all players that were kept off the final roster for this reason. But while most bring this up as a negative due to the postponement, no one mentions the positive effects. For example, the players getting a whole additional year to gain more game time and experience, which players like Justin Glad, Aaron Herrera, Jackson Ewell, and Jonathan Lewis, just to name a few, all benefited from. And so it seems fair that if you're going to mention the cons of the postponement, you should also mention the pros. Another excuse that's been used is that the European based players were not available because clubs weren't required by FIFA to release them. Now, while that is true, that doesn't mean that clubs couldn't be persuaded to release some of those players. In fact, back on the original final roster in 2020, before COVID, before the postponement, that roster included four European based players, which means that clubs were willing to release them despite not being required to by FIFA. Now, some try to also use COVID as a reason why some clubs simply didn't want to or couldn't release players because of supposed government restrictions on travel. However, if that was completely true, then no European based players would have been at the tournament. Except, wait a minute, there was. For example, in my video previewing the Dominican Republic game, I mentioned how 8 of their players played in Europe, Spain and Germany to be specific. And so those players being present proved two things. One, that there were no such government restrictions, at least not from those countries. And two, that European clubs were still willing to release players despite COVID and despite not being required to by FIFA. And so what it really came down to was how good Jason Kreis's people skills were and how good he was at cultivating fruitful relationships with those clubs, how much of an effort was really made by him and US Soccer as a whole to get those players released. And I'm not saying that he should have gotten Pulisic, McKinney, or Adams, but what about those players that were on the preliminary roster, such as Chris Gloucester, Eric Palmer Brown, Brendan Aronson, Brian Reynolds, and Conrad de la Fuente? Now, yes, players like Brendan Aronson, Brian Reynolds, and Reggie Cannon all got moves to Europe rather recently. But that doesn't mean their clubs would automatically not be willing to release them. It depends. If the club stated that they were not willing to release them because they wanted their player to focus on getting settled in, training with the team, especially if they were considered to be starters on their new team, well, that would make sense. But I can't find any sources that prove that those clubs directly refused to release those players despite Crease's and US Soccer's attempts. In fact, there is little to no information at all about how much of an effort was really made by Crease and US Soccer to get those players. For example, Brendan Aronson. Now, he was on the original 2020 roster, and he was on the 2021 preliminary roster, and he moved to Austria side Salzburg in January of this year. So now, if he was released, he would have been in Mexico at the beginning of March for training, leading up to the tournament itself. So that would have given him just 2 months in Austria. Not a lot of time. And again, would be understandable if that is the reason Salzburg refused to release him. But something to keep in mind is that their manager, Jesse March, is an American, and no doubt would be sympathetic to the U.S. qualifying. So again, the question is how much of an effort was made by U.S. Soccer here? Did they try to play up to his American sympathies? Did they explain how important the player was to their team and their hopes to qualify? Maybe try to work something out with them so they would release him. And even the player himself, in past interviews, stated that he would have been more than willing to go and help out his team.
I think that for me, I would love to represent the United States in the Olympics, and that would be a fantastic opportunity for me.
Now, of course, it's not down to him to decide whether he goes or not, which is why, again, the majority of the blame should lie directly at Kreis and U.S. Soccer. Another player is Conrad de la Fuente. Now, he plays for the Barca B team, their youth team, and has been with them for some time, so the excuse that he just moved there can't be used. And I find it incredibly hard to believe that the club just wasn't willing to release him. If the Dominican Republic can convince Spanish teams to release their players, then US Soccer, a much bigger organization with much more resources, should be able to as well. So again, the only reason can be that Kreis simply didn't select him or cared or tried hard enough to get him released. Chris Gloucester was another European based player at the time, but it's clear that he simply just wasn't chosen to be on the team by Kreis. PSV Eindhoven, his team at the time, would have definitely released him. Now, how do we know this? Well, because it was reported by then that the club was already planning on him leaving altogether. So they definitely had no reason at all for not release him for the tournament. Now, currently, he is back in the States with NYCFC, so he will be playing in MLS this season. Now, it can be that he just wasn't performing well, in club and in camp, and that's why Kreis decided to leave him off the roster. But the point here is that the excuse that European-based players were not available because clubs refused to release them simply isn't true, at least not for all of them. It's actually because Kreis either didn't think they were needed, or didn't try hard enough to get them released, or simply didn't think that they were good enough. But considering the fact that we failed to qualify shows that he was clearly wrong on some of his roster picks. But not only did they fail with the European based players, but even with domestic players as well. As we all know, Atlanta United refused to release their players for this roster. And that included players like left back George Bello and center back Miles Robinson, someone that would have been an automatic starter as he was by far our best option at center back, a place where the final roster and team ended up struggling a lot, especially in the first few games. Now, yes, in this case, it is confirmed that the club is the one that refused to release the players. But again, this is Atlanta United, an MLS team. You mean to tell me that US Soccer was incapable of convincing a US team to release two of their players? No matter how you try to slice it, that's just embarrassing. You can't even get a team from your own country to release players to help you in Olympic qualifiers. What a joke. And this also reveals a deeper problem that goes beyond Jason Kreis, but I'll get more into that later. Now, to be honest, I am by no means an expert on soccer tactics. I have no coaching experience, so my opinions on the matter are totally from a fan's perspective. That said, even with my untrained eye, I still notice some issues here. But first, let's explain what system, formations, and general tactics that Kreis himself stated that his team would use. First off, he used a 4-3-3 formation. That included two center backs, two fullbacks, one center defensive midfielder, two center midfielders, two wingers, and then, of course, a striker. Now, in attack, what that means is that the two fullbacks play as wide as possible and make forward runs to stretch the opposition defense to create space in the middle. The two center backs push up and hold a high defensive line, with, of course, the center defensive mid in front of them acting like a shield. Now, using a false nine in this formation, which Kreis did, it has the striker dropping deeper back and almost to act as a fourth midfielder that can outnumber players in the middle and help progress the ball forward. Or draw opposition center backs out of position, creating space for attacking midfielders or wingers to use. Now, the wingers can also cut inside, which in turn creates more space in the channels for the fullbacks to use. They can move forward, cross the ball in, where in theory, several players should be ready to receive the ball. But now, why didn't this work very well for the US? Well, something that Kreis either didn't realize or just straight up ignored is that this system and style of play, playing out from the back, possession based, the false nine, all of that, is actually designed for players who thrive in confined spaces because of their finishing and close ball control. And it works best with technically adept central midfielders who can control the game by dominating possession. Notice the emphasis here on technical players that are needed to make this kind of system work. And yet, Kreis chose mostly what kind of players on his final 20-man roster? Yes, this was a common complaint as soon as that roster dropped, that the majority of athletic players and lack of technical players included in the roster. To briefly explain the difference between them for those who aren't familiar, athletic means players that are maybe bigger and have a good conditioning that can run up and down the pitch all day, but maybe aren't the most technical, which means that they're not particularly well with the ball, passing, dribbling, all of that. An athlete can be strong and fast, but not very skillful with the ball. And again, what kind of players work best with this type of system that Crace chose? Yes, technical ones, because they are good in tight spaces because they have good ball control. Now, it would be okay to have a roster with a good mix of athletic players and technical players, but a roster that is mostly made up of athletic players and that has hardly any technical players is not very good in general, but especially not good with this type of system. But not only did Kree's final roster lack technical players, he also lacked creative ones, especially in the midfield. Now, what does that mean? Creative players are ones that are diverse with their skills, dribbling, and quick passing decisions. With this and their high soccer IQ, they're able to create plays and chances that others couldn't even see or even think of. Now, if this seems similar to technical players, it's because it is. All creative players are technical because they require that ball control and skill with the ball in order to be creative. Yeah, so a lack of creative technical players was a big problem. In fact, the most technical player on that roster was probably Johnny Cardoso. But did it have to be that way? While yes, the original roster did include Uli Giannis as well, and he obviously would have been a great help, but unfortunately he was injured during training. But who was he replaced by? Did Crace choose another technical winger? No, instead he chose Tanner Tessman. A good player, don't get me wrong, and he ultimately played relatively well in the few minutes he had on the pitch, but he is definitely more of an athletic player rather than technical. Not to mention that he plays a completely different position than Giannis as well. Giannis is a technical attacking winger, and Tessman is an athletic midfielder. Apples to oranges. So this replacement did have a lot of fans scratching their heads. And so it really shouldn't come as a surprise that these players did have a difficult time being effective in the system. And even Johnny Cardoso's struggles can also be down to not having other technical players around him to play well off of, like he is used to playing at Internacional in Brazil, which, as you expect, has mostly technical players. And this is made all the worse when one sees that Kreis could have picked more technical players. And no, I'm not just talking about the European based ones. He had other domestic options that were on the provisional roster and so were, most likely to be released by their clubs. But he simply decided not to pick them. Players like Caden Clark and even Frankie Amaya and Cole Bassett, I'm told, are more technical as well. And they are midfielders and could have done a lot better as the US struggled specifically in the midfield in every game. Now, another problem I have with Crace's tactics, or lack thereof in this case, is that while it's clear that this was his plan A, the 4-3-3 with a false nine, and yes, it's a solid plan A, but every good coach is able to change things up when things don't go as planned. But it's clear Crace wasn't able to do that. There was no plan B at all, which makes it all the more confusing that the other striker he chose to back up Jesus Ferreira was Sebastian Soto. Now, at first, I liked this because he was a completely different type of striker than Jesus. Jesus played best as a false nine, which worked perfectly for Crace's system. But Soto is a poacher striker. He works best at making runs, getting in good positions, and waiting for the ball to then finish off. And Crace himself said the reason he chose Soto was because he offered this different type of option to Jesus, which is great, but only if he had an inkling of a plan to utilize Soto in that specific way, which it's clear he didn't. In fact, every time Soto did come on, he had to play as a false nine, something he simply wasn't and isn't good at, which is fine. He simply isn't that kind of striker, plain and simple. And when he made that mistake, which led to a goal in the Mexico game, he was dropping deep to receive the ball just like a false nine does. But again, since that's not his game, he made that mistake and gave up the goal. Honestly, can't really blame him that much for playing badly in this system that clearly didn't accommodate his playing style or skill set. And if you pay attention to Soto during the different times he was on the pitch, especially off the ball, During the times he was on the field, he would make good runs, get in good positions to score, but never got the ball in those positions. And when he did get the service, it wasn't particularly good, or a defender just did a good job at stopping him, like against Honduras, where defender Maldonado does a great job at reading the play, beats Soto to the cross, and is able to block his header. And another time Soto was in a good position was when Lewis got a header in the same game. Now here, Soto is actually just ahead of him and right in front of goal, but still seems to be onside. So Lewis, instead of just slamming the ball straight to a defender, which he did, he could have just nodded it towards Soto, kind of guided it to him, where Soto could have simply put it away easily since he would have had an open shot. So even though Soto didn't have a good performance at all, I think it's mostly down to Kreis's tactics and clear lack of an attacking plan that utilized Soto as a poacher. Instead, he would just throw him on and expect to just make something happen. Now, before I go into the next and final section, once again, just a quick reminder to please hit that like button. It really does help the channel if you haven't already, and consider subscribing. And if you do, please don't forget to turn on notifications for more content. And if you know any other like-minded fans of American soccer, consider sharing this video with them and help the channel grow. All right, on with the video. Now this brings us to another excuse. This one given by Kreis himself, that the players and the team as a whole simply weren't good enough to get it over the line. This is something I've seen also online by fans. Now, while it simply can't be ignored or denied that most of our players didn't perform particularly well, but we should look deeper into that and ask why not? Was it because they really didn't have the quality, or because of the wrong system and tactics chosen by Kreis? Now, before I get into that, I do also want to address this issue and why I have a problem with Kreis trying to essentially scapegoat his players.
And at the end of the day, I just don't think we had enough. And I don't know that I've ever seen a game where we've had players miscontrol the ball so much, balls rolling under people's feet, passing out of bounds. It's really, you kind of scratch your head and you're thinking, what's going on here?
And another news article connected what he said there with what Kreis had said previously in his last post-match press conference for Orlando City, the job he had before he got this one, the U23 job. And look what he says to explain the loss of that game.
We need players to step forward. We need players to decide that enough is enough. I think that we're going to have to talk to some individual players about the performances that we're seeing. We're going to have to expect more. We're going to have to demand more.
Notice the similarities? On both occasions, he never once tries to take responsibility and instead insinuates that it was the players' fault for simply not being good enough, or as he said several times after losing to Honduras, that they lacked the quality. But hold on here. Who is supposed to know that before the players even step onto the pitch? Who's supposed to choose the right and best players for the team, the ones that have the quality, according to Kreis? It's him, the head coach. He is the one responsible. Now, in all fairness, when he criticized the players' inability to control the ball well and poor passing, he isn't necessarily wrong. In fact, these are issues I mentioned in my past recap videos about in the same games. But should the head coach be saying such things after this particular loss about his players? Personally, I've always disliked managers that publicly scapegoat their players after a loss. I felt that the best coaches are the ones that defend their players publicly, but will definitely give them constructive criticism privately. That's how they help their players improve without damaging their confidence. But it's clear that Jason Kreis is not that kind of coach. And so it's actually one of the several reasons why he was not the right man for this job. Also, all of those problems should have been present during training and when he was still selecting his roster. There is no way you're going to tell me that somehow the passing was great and the team played perfectly well in training to then somehow have all of those problems just magically show up during the game. No way. Those same problems with passing, the control of the ball, most certainly were seen during training as well. So it was up to him to work on those issues and choose the players that weren't making those kind of mistakes. So did he just see those problems and then simply shrug his shoulders and think that they'd be ironed out during the tournament itself? Again, not very good coaching or decision making here. So after analyzing Kreis's decisions when it came to tactics, roster selection, as well as the overall mentality and attitude he has displayed, shows that without a doubt, Kreis was never going to be the right person to finally get the US qualified for the Olympics. He made mistakes and the wrong choices for every important decision there was. Which begs the question, why was he chosen to do so at all? Now, this video ended up being way longer than originally expected since I also wanted to talk about the role US soccer played in this failure. It's not all on Jason Kreis, but we know it's time to look even beyond him and see the higher ups that chose him as the manager to get this job done. And what does that say about them and this organization as a whole, and what changes need to be made moving forward so this doesn't happen again. But I'm going to have to get into all of that probably in a part 3 video sometime later. So now, what did you all think about Jason Kreis as our head coach that failed to get the U.S. qualified for the Olympics this cycle? What did you think of his roster selection and tactics? What do you think he could have done better? Let me know down below. And once again, please remember to like and subscribe. And consider, if this is the first video you're seeing, check out part 1 of this type of series where we're kind of delving deeper into what this failure means. Part 1 is more of a recap and review of the game against Honduras, that semifinal game. Go ahead and watch that and then wait for part 3. Thanks for watching. This is American Soccer United, the place where American soccer fans unite.